Welcome to the course Demystifying the Brain. This 4-week course is based on my book by the same title, Demystifying the Brain, which is also available on NPTEL. So, the objective of this course is, as the title suggests, to demystify the brain. So, over the last 3 to 4 decades, neuroscience has progressed rapidly with research growing explosively. Contemporary media tends to hype up the brain. It gives tidbits of disconnected information which dazzle the reader, but do not lead him or her to comprehension. It does not give any insight. So, for example, you might read that the number of states or connections in the brain exceed the number of atoms in the universe. These kinds of statements may be true or partly true, but they do not give any insights into how brain works. Another thing that you notice in popular media is it often focuses on the complexity of the brain, but complex systems are not new to us, right. A Boeing 787 or an international space station are complex, but we are able to master their complexity because we know their working principles. In fact, that is the reason why we are able to design them and construct them. So, brain too is complex, but only in detail. It is actually quite simple in its fundamental principles, and these details can be mastered if we first understand its working principles. But part of the reason why brain is presented as something so complex is perhaps because neuroscience is a branch of biology, and biologists like to focus on details and not so much on the working principles. A biologist often tends to be reductionist, right, because modern biology operates on the premise that life is chemical. It is essentially a chemical structure. So, there is an attempt to explain all biological phenomena in terms of the chemical building blocks of life. But engineering and physics, these fields do not work that way. If you want to design an aircraft wing, you do not study the action of individual molecules on the wing. You study the airflow as a fluid flow and use perhaps Navier-Stokes equation, right, to study the fluid flow on the aircraft wing. Or take the example of planetary motion. You want to study the orbit of the planets around the sun, right. You do not have to know all the details of the mass distribution inside the planets and mass distribution inside the sun and so on. You do not even have to deal with them as spheres. Just assume that they are points, point masses, and this approximation or this simple abstraction is enough to get very accurate models of planetary orbits or very accurate estimates of planetary orbits. So, similarly, if you want to study an electrical circuit or a VLSI circuit, you do not have to study the flow of individual electrons, right, as they flow through the wires. So, you deal with large scale abstractions called resistors or capacitors and transistors and so on, and with that you can design and construct very large circuits. So, thing is, if you look at engineering or in physics, every phenomenon there is an abstraction, there is an appropriate abstraction, and this abstraction is expressed in terms of mathematical equations. And the abstraction or the metaphor makes the entire field quite simple and comprehensible. I mean, it could be complex only in the details, but in its essence it is quite simple because it is reduced to a bunch of principles, and these principles are expressed in terms of equations, right, and it is these principles that would make the systems seem delightfully simple. So, same thing should happen in neuroscience also, and actually that is happening. It has begun to happen about 3 to 4 decades ago. Right. In fact, if you can trace the early beginnings all the way to the 1940s, like almost a century ago, right. But in the 80s there was a revolution in brain science, and since then there has been a rapid progress. So, the results of these developments are expressed in terms of mathematics, in the language of mathematics, but it is possible to explain the basic ideas without explicit use of mathematics and equations, right, and make the ideas accessible to those who do not deal with or do not have to deal with maths in their work. So, thus the aim of this course is to present the new ideas of neuroscience that have emerged out of research performed over the last 3 or 4 decades in a manner that is comprehensible to anyone with a basic training in science. So, somebody who has the knowledge of physics, chemistry, biology and maths, right, maybe at high school level or a +2 level, right, should be able to understand exactly what is going on in this course. So, if you look at the kind of people who might find this course useful, it could be a doctor like who wishes to get an idea of the new developments. So, doctors are trained in a lot of anatomy and physiology and so on, but they can get this new computational perspective of the brain without having to deal with the mathematics. Or if you are an engineer and if you wish to learn about neuroscience, what is all the hype about, and if you want to maybe go for higher studies in neuroscience and go for a PhD in neuroscience, right? Then, but you don't want to deal with all the biology jargon, which is sometimes can be quite intimidating, right? Then this is the right course for you. Good, it's a good introduction to neuroscience. Or if you are a humanities student or a poet or a writer, right, you're just curious about what's all this neuro fuss about, then this is a very good course for you. So there are 9 lectures in this course, and each lecture has multiple segments. The first lecture is on history of neuroscience. So we start from the ancient Greeks and how people thought about neuroscience, and how especially over the last couple of centuries, the developments in various branches of science have shaped our understanding, our current understanding of brain. Then the second lecture is about brain through evolution. So this lecture starts with the question of why is brain the way it is shaped. I mean, we know that brain has 2 hemispheres, and there is this long tail called the spinal cord. Why is it like that? Because in biology, typically the question why is not asked as often as you would like to ask it. Because this is interesting, because if you look at lower animals, invertebrates very often, very small creatures don't have a brain or a spinal cord, they just have a diffuse nerve net, and through evolution you see these neurons coming together and forming clusters, and in mammals and in humans you find this kind of a brain and spinal cord. Why does it happen? What are the fundamental principles that shape the brain in this fashion through evolution? So the third lecture is about neurons and neural signaling. So here we introduce the idea that neurons are like an electrical circuit, and they produce voltages and voltage fluctuations, and there are currents going in and out of the cell. So how does all this happen? So we explain this machinery of the neural signaling. Then in the fourth lecture we construct small networks out of these neurons. So we abstract these neurons into simplified terms and construct networks out of these neurons. So in these networks you have clusters of neurons which are connected in a kind of a serial fashion, in a feed forward fashion, and then we show how such networks can learn. And using such network models, without using mathematics, we show how you can explain a lot of psychological phenomena. Then with this kind of a conceptual base, we then introduce the organization of nervous system. So this is the kind of thing that maybe a medical student would start the discussion on brain with, but we thought we'll first give a conceptual base in terms of the new ideas, new jargon, and then present the classical traditional description of brain in these new terms. Then the next lecture, lecture 5, is on maps in the brain. So very often you find that information in the brain is laid out on 2-dimensional surfaces in the form of maps. Now these maps is a very powerful way of describing how brain represents the world, and also how processes the input coming from the world. So we describe what are the fundamental principles of these maps, and what are the mechanisms by which these maps form, and so on in this lecture. In the next lecture, lecture 7, is on memories and how memories are represented, how we think memories are represented, and how it also talks about an important structure in the brain, a memory related structure called hippocampus. How does it work, and how does it store in memories in itself, and so on. Then in the next lecture, lecture 8, it's about emotions. So this lecture talks about emotions the way they are discussed in philosophy, in psychology, and then it talks about the neural substrates of emotions in brain, and then at the end of the lecture we try to propose a kind of a very broad outline of how we can think about the emotional machinery in the brain. Then the last lecture, lecture 9, is about the theories of consciousness, because any theory of brain should address the most exciting and profound question about brain's activity, which is consciousness, because everything in the brain's activity doesn't enter your consciousness. You may not be aware of everything that's happening in your brain, right? So what are the conditions under which something that's happening in the brain enters your consciousness? So what are people saying about it? What are philosophers saying about it? What are scientists saying about it? So unlike before, consciousness used to be discussed by philosophers and people from kind of religious backgrounds, but it's a new challenge that we are facing here. That is, how do you describe consciousness purely from a neurobiology or a neuroscientific standpoint? So theories that are proposed with this kind of a standpoint are quickly summarized in this lecture. So that's all. So hope you enjoy the lecture, and may the neuro force be with you. Thank you.